Welcome to Two Messianic Jews. Today I'm joined by Christian apologist Michael Jones, the founder and director of Inspiring Philosophy. For the past 13 years, Michael has been producing high-quality YouTube content that's really had a big impact on both Eric and myself in our apologetics journey. His work especially inspired us to create content that's both academically rigorous and accessible to a wide audience. And one of the main topics that Michael's focused on is the historical reliability of the Gospels, one of the many topics that he covers on his channel. And the historical reliability of the Gospels is exactly what we're going to discuss today. So welcome, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to start this discussion by having you interact with a popular video from the Jewish counter missionary YouTube channel, Jews for Judaism. And in this video, Rabbi Michael Skobac, who's the director of education there at Jews for Judaism, he addresses Jesus' resurrection, and he devotes time in the video to argue against the reliability of the gospel. So I'd like to examine a few of the key objections and really get your take.
Sure.
Great. So just pull that up here.
We should bear in mind that the authors of the Christian Bible were not objective historians or journalists. They were written by fervent believers in Jesus. The writer of John says in chapter 20, verse 31, that he wrote his gospel in order to convince people to believe in Jesus. He's admitting, he's telling you, I had an agenda when I wrote this text. I'm not a historian. I'm basically a preacher. I'm a salesperson. I'm writing what's really more of religious propaganda than a journalistic report. I'm trying to convince people. And these are the people that wrote the Gospels. The other Gospel writers had the same agenda.
Have you ever heard of the Tanakh? Did any of those writers, were they objective historians without any biases? Were they not trying to convince people to worship Adonai, the God of Israel? I mean, like, this is really, really odd because A, he's poisoning the well. He's ignoring the fact that every ancient writer had biases and every modern writer has biases, except maybe the guy that wrote the telephone book. No modern historian writes from a completely objective standpoint. I don't know anyone who would claim this. Plutarch didn't. Tacitus didn't. Suetonius didn't. Josephus didn't. Who are these writers? Were the writers of the Talmud completely objective and unbiased and not trying to push an agenda? Like, none of this has anything to do with whether or not the Gospels are reliable or true or not.
Right.
And it's such special pleading because, like, dude, you're going to, if I were to use those, or if an atheist were to use those arguments against the books of the Tanakh, he would say exactly what I'm saying right now.
Right. Yeah. The way I see it is he's presenting the Gospels as a sort of literature that's propaganda, as opposed to seeing it really as historical, which I find really odd. And so I really want to ask you, like, what are the Gospels? How can you help us understand, like, what are the Gospels? What kind of ancient literary genre are they? Are they what Rabbi Skobac, he's presenting it as sort of theological propaganda or preaching? But how can we understand this?
Yeah, so the consensus of scholars today is that the Gospels are lives or ancient Greco-Roman biographies. Now, that's a loose genre. It's not like a very strict thing, but we do recognize certain genres from the ancient world. The Gospels were not novels. They were not exhaustive histories telling us about the geography and ancient past, this kind of stuff. Acts is probably going to be more similar to a history, and the Gospels are biographies. So this was an important genre. And so Richard Burridge basically wrote a book, What Are the Gospels? Convinced scholars that, yes, they are ancient Greco-Roman biographies, moving scholarship away from the old idea that they were originally, unique Christian documents that were just compiling urban legends or tall tales or, gossip. So The interesting thing about that is when you were writing a biography, you were writing it to preserve history. You were trying to tell the most accurate tale you could about the sage, philosopher, or person you were writing the biography about. And this was also in the first century. Okay. Craig Keener wrote a book called Christobiography, when he notes that there were fictional biographies, but you did not write a fictional biography within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. That was very much against the culture of the time. Josephus scolded one of his opponents for waiting, several years to write his work after eyewitnesses had passed away. So if you're writing within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, you're writing to preserve history. So this is what Craig Keener basically found in his research. The Gospels are clearly written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. So they're not fictional works. They're aiming to preserve history. Whoever was writing the Gospels were trying their best to tell us the facts about Jesus on the ground. Did they have biases? Of course. Every writer has biases. But we see things they do that would go against their biases. So like Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist, tells us that Peter denying Jesus right before the crucifixion is something no early Christian would have made up, because you're basically throwing shade on the leader of the early church, or one of the most prominent leaders. No one would have made that up and attacked Peter in that way. Same with John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, okay? Why is he accepting baptism if he is perfect and the Son of God? Something no early Christian writer would have made up. So they preserved a lot of important details. We often bring up the women discovering the empty tomb. Celsus attacked Christians because, their witnesses to this were some frantic woman. Because in the ancient world, the testimony of a woman was not the same as the testimony of a man. We see, for example, in the later heretical work, the Gospel of Peter, he's got an entire crowd at the empty tomb. Like the Pharisees are there, the disciples are there, like everyone's there because they need witnesses. Where the Gospels tell it like it is. The women discover the tomb. Now that would have been very, very embarrassing in the ancient culture, but the Gospel authors were telling us the historical facts. This is just the tip of the iceberg. They preserve so much of that kind of information. So it tells us, yes, they did have biases. They wanted you to believe Jesus is the Messiah and is God, but they were not making up facts as far as we can tell.
Right. And when you say there were biographies that were fiction, but the Gospels were not intended that way. I think of Luke chapter 1, where Luke says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word.
Now that Greek word is often used for the Hebrew word hazan. Now, these were specific people that would keep the scrolls in the synagogue, the hazans of the word. And Luke tells us in the early church there were hazans of the word there. In other words, there were specific people who were keeping the tradition of Jesus. It was their job to teach the traditions and the stories of Jesus. This was a formal position in the early church because of that word that Luke has used. So it tells us that this was not just hearsay, campfire stories. The church had specific people designed to pass on the oral traditions of Jesus, to preserve them and keep them accurate until we see the Gospels being written. And so then they're written down by that point. So by the time Luke is writing, we have hazans basically keeping a controlled, informal tradition of Jesus to pass on to the church and people that they bring into the church.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I recently watched that in your video on the gospel reliability, and chazan is a term that's used today in Orthodox synagogues, and to find that parallel in Luke, I think it's great. So when it comes to preserving memory in the ancient world, like today we think we're so reliant on technology, even like ChatGPT, for example, or just things that organize our notes. But in the ancient world, they had to be more reliant on their memory. So could you help us understand the significance of that when it comes to understanding the gospel writers being able to preserve the Jesus tradition that you say the Chazan or the Chazans were controlling that tradition as you're speaking of?
Yeah, and scholars that have specialized in oral tradition, like Jan Vasina Richard Horsley, for example, have noted that like we have a Western bias against oral tradition. We tend to think it can't be reliable. But cultures that don't have a lot of written documents that function around oral traditions do have built-in mechanisms and principles that keep their traditions reliable for several generations.
Mm.
And I've used this for, Hebrew Bible reliability. Like, because you get atheists that will attack the Hebrew Bible for being unreliable because it was oral traditions before written down. And I'm like, well, hold on. These were oral cultures. And from studying, like you check out books like Dynamics of Tradition, Perspectives on Oral Poetry and Folk Belief, Narratives of Our Past, The Social Construction of Oral History, The African Past Speaks, edited by Joseph C. Miller. We see plenty of evidence that cultures could preserve oral traditions for several generations. And the Gospels are being written down when the eyewitnesses were still alive. So, yeah, they very much had features to memorize certain things. Ancient writers that will talk about how, like, some people would memorize the entire Iliad and Odyssey, for example. This is just what ancient people did. I was just reading a book, The Worlds of Medieval Europe by Clifford Bauckham. He says the same thing was happening in the medieval period, that people were memorizing, like monks were memorizing the entire Psalms, for example. This was normal for them. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that it's a lot easier to memorize rhythmic things. So you could think of like how many songs you can memorize or say off the top of your head. Commercials you heard in the 90s. If you hear like one line of it, I'm sure you'll be able to repeat the whole dang thing because it played so much. When something is in a rhythmic, poetic, or musical fashion, it's very easy for us to memorize. What's interesting is that scholars have noted that Jesus spoke in that same kind of fashion. Scholars, David On, for example, talks about how Jesus spoke in a parallelismus membarum. So he would speak kind of moments in a rhythmic passion, like ask and it shall be given to you, knock and it shall be open. These kind of sayings he would speak in. David On, I believe, estimates that 80% of Jesus's sayings in the Gospels are in this rhythmic nature. So if Jesus is basically speaking in a poetic fashion, be very easy to memorize. You can think of like the Quran in Arabic. It's rhythmic, it's poetic. It's very easy for Muslims to memorize it if they're native Arabic speakers. Same with Jesus's disciples. He's speaking to them. It's easy for them to pick up, memorize, move on. He also spoke in parables. Okay, stories are very easy to remember. You go up to someone on the street and ask him, tell me one of Jesus's parables. 9 times out of 10, if somebody went to Sunday school once, they're probably going to be able to tell you basic structure of the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, something like that, because it's very easy to memorize stories. Jesus spoke in, hyperbole. It's a lot easier to memorize things like even some of our own sayings, like go an extra mile, go back to Jesus. Like these kind of things go back to him because it's easy to memorize. So not only was this a culture meant for fostering strong memories, Jesus structured his words in a way that would have been made it exceptionally easy to memorize what he said and pass it on. And so now take what I just said and think about that. If you're writing fiction, there's no reason to make your rabbi speak in an oral fashion that was rhythmic, poetic, easy to memorize. It makes more sense that the reason why Jesus speaks that way is because that's the way he actually spoke in oral culture. If you're writing fiction, you can make him say whatever you want. You can make him say anything. You don't have to worry about trying to say, well, we have to pretend that he was an oral rabbi speaking and preserving and saying things in a rhythmic fashion to make it mimic like we'll be able to memorize it. No, you're making up fiction. And you're not trying to worry that you're not trying to fool scholars 2,000 years later. So what we see in the Gospels fits with the idea that Jesus was speaking these things in a way that a rabbi of the time would speak, in a rhythmic fashion that was easy to memorize. And that's what it appears to be when we read the Gospels. It just seems to flow naturally from that.
I've heard you mention in the past also that the idea of memorizing the Torah and the what was kind of the expectation when it comes to Jewish people during the first century when it comes to not only memorizing the teachings of the rabbi but also the written Torah.
Yeah, it was very much on the Jews of the first century to memorize large sections of the Torah or the Tanakh in general. I mean, they would hear it in synagogue, they'd hear it being read aloud, and then they would take it to heart and they would memorize it to repeat because you couldn't just go get a copy of the Torah. for your household. Those were very, very expensive things because those were hand copied. So people just committed them to memory and memorizing them. Again, Clifford Bauckham notes that in the medieval period, monks could memorize the entire Psalms, like the entire Psalms. That's crazy to me and you because we live in a culture where we're
Yeah.
flooded with written documents. But in an ancient culture or medieval culture where documents were expensive because they had to be hand copied, it's actually easier to try to memorize that. And when you're training your memory to do that, it's not going to be that hard after a while.
Yeah. Yeah. Skobac also makes another point to say that they're written by believers to convince people to believe. Do you, in your view, and it may differ depending on the gospel, but do you see the gospels as written to believers or to convince those who don't believe? Like, who's the
Uh,
audience there?
yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably whoever they thought. We know the early Christians were very obsessed with trying to convert people because of the Great Commission that Jesus gave. They really wanted to get that message out. This is why Paul wrote all these letters. That's why they're
Mhm.
establishing churches everywhere. I think very much the Gospels were written primarily to edify believers and teach them about Jesus, but also they were apologetic works as well to try and get the message out to non-believers. Now that doesn't mean they're
Sure.
unreliable on works. There's a lot of really good evidence that what we're reading is reliable works. And you just go through
Yeah.
Craig Blomberg's book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. He lists fact after fact after fact after fact that John just gets right over and over again. So I mean, like something can be apologetic and good. I mean, think of, for example, let's say like a study was done on a food product and it showed the food product was very healthy. Well, the company is going to promote that study because they want to sell more of their food. That doesn't mean just because they're biased and they're promoting their food that what they're presenting is incorrect information. A lot of times when people are doing apologetics, they're trying to get their facts right because they want you to believe it's true because it what they're presenting conforms to the facts of reality. I mean, that's what I do often. I want to
Yeah.
get you the facts to show you Christianity is true because I know people can go check these things. So I'm trying very hard to not make mistakes and get you accurate information because
Mhm.
I don't want it to come back to me that I made a big mistake and now you're going to distrust Christianity. Why couldn't ancient apologists or Christians be thinking in a similar fashion?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think of even today when it comes to, unfortunately, we're living in such a time of anti-Semitism, and there's people who would deny the Holocaust took place, which is absurd. But what you see is that there's many Jewish historians of the Holocaust who are really, even though they're biased to preserve what happened because of just the fact that it's our Jewish history, they're going to preserve those details with much clarity, even given their bias. There's even seems to be a motivating factor to preserve what took place. Israeli history, American history, like people have
Mm-hmm.
biases. I'm with you there. So I'm going to play another clip from Rabbi Skobac, and I want
Okay.
to get your take on it.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who were part of Jesus' inner circle, either while he was alive or shortly after he died, never wrote these books in the Christian Bible. Now, they're commonly referred to as the Gospel according to Matthew, and the Gospel according to Mark, and the Gospel according to Luke, and the Gospel according to John. But if you get your hands on a manuscript of the Greek Christian text, it never mentions these men. It never says in the actual text, this document is written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. At the end, it doesn't say, faithfully written by Mark. These men's names are nowhere to be found in the Christian Bible as the authors of these documents. These documents were written anonymously. They're written anonymously. The authors are not identified. It was only later on, into the 2nd century, that church tradition began to develop this idea that the authors of these books were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
My question to you is, do you agree that the Gospels were written anonymously?
Internally, yes, they were written internally anonymous. That does not
Okay.
mean they were externally anonymous, though.
So what external evidence do you have for the authorship of the Gospels?
Yeah, well, this guy just is demonstrating he does not actually understand the history and the culture of the time. Most of the biographies from the ancient world were internally anonymous. Okay. Tacitus' biography of his father-in-law, all of Plutarch's lives were written internally anonymous. They never say, I, Plutarch, wrote this. It was basically the custom in the ancient world. You'd write the biography internally anonymous. And then Simon Gathercole notes you'd identify the author in a title, on a flyleaf, on the outside of the scroll, on a tag. There were many ways you would do this kind of thing. So, like, the Gospels fit very much with the cultural context of the time. And of course, every single manuscript we have found where there is a title page, I'm not talking about the fragmented ones, but where we've had a title page, they always attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We never found one that is actually written without a title that is not fragmented.
So that's really key, because in the video, Rabbi Skobac was mentioning like these attributions are not in the Greek manuscript evidence, and you're saying that that's what we find when it comes to the titles of the Gospels.
Yeah, anytime we find any of the a non-fragmented one, I want to be clear, because sometimes we'll find like a piece of John. Okay, it doesn't have the title page on it. And recently, an atheist was like complaining P52 doesn't claim it was written by John. I was like, well, duh. It's the size of a credit card. Like, on what do you expect? I mean, so, and this is kind of, again, this just shows a double standard from the rabbi here, because who wrote First and Second Kings, First and Second Samuel, Esther? There's no titles on those. We don't say, I, the scribe of, Jeremiah, wrote this. It doesn't have that. Not all of the books of the Hebrew Bible have authors ascribed to them. So why is this a problem here, but it's not a problem for the Tanakh? Again, double standard coming from the rabbi here. And again, now he brings up the titles of the 2nd century. Well, he's ignoring a lot of data. First of all, Papias does mention Matthew and Mark being 2 gospel authors, I believe, very early in the 2nd century. So we have that, for example. We have Justin Martyr calling the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles. And what's interesting is he says in the memoirs of Peter, he changed the names of the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. Now, that only happens in Mark's gospel. What's church tradition? Mark was the interpreter or scribe of Peter. So if they were making up titles, why didn't they just attribute that gospel to Peter? Justin Martyr set a precedent here. They didn't, though. They attributed it to Mark, his interpreter. That's odd. Why not just go right to Peter? Well, why weren't they talking about the titles until the late 2nd century? Well, because no one was really contesting them, as far as we can tell. What happened in the 2nd century was a guy named Marcion tried to sneak in an anonymous gospel. The Tertullian says he basically took Luke and mutilated it, and then tried to sneak in this anonymous gospel. And then the church was immediately like, well, we don't accept anonymous gospels. We've only accepted the gospels that came from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is what Irenaeus talks about. This is what Clement talks about. Tertullian talks about this. Origen as well. There was an issue that came up, and immediately they're like, what are you talking about? But prior to that, no one had really contested this whole issue until Marcion tried to sneak in this anonymous gospel. Then the church was like, not happening. There was a reason as to why no one was talking about the titles till then. But even that's still far better. Like, for example, Plutarch's Lives, like one of the earliest, I think, is like a catalog. And it actually attributes the lives to Plutarch's son, not Plutarch. But we say the lives of Plutarch are written by Plutarch because every single manuscript says they were written by Plutarch. Okay? So we have contradictory accounts. Guess what we don't have for the Gospels? Contradictory accounts. Every early church father says it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first person to ever really question these titles was Faustus, who was writing in the time of Augustine. So much, much later. Very, very odd feature if these Gospels were originally anonymous. And then we can bring up Hebrews. Like, if they were making up titles, why did they make up a title for the book of Hebrews, which is truly anonymous? They weren't sure who wrote it, but they didn't make up a title for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just to make a comparison with Jewish literature, I was looking into the authorship of First Kings, and in the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Batra, it mentions that Jeremiah is the author, but that comes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. But to say that, 2nd century, it's very good by comparison. But what you're saying about the attributions, the titles of the Gospels, how early is the manuscript evidence for for these titles?
I mean, so it depends because, they weren't collected until, I believe, the 4th century. Like our earliest like complete codex we have is of like Codex Sinaiticus, which again is also helpful for the Hebrew Bible. I mean, this is again kind of funny because the reliability of the New Testament far exceeds the reliability of the Hebrew Bible. So like a lot of his attacks, if he was successful, would would apply to Hebrew Bible in far worse ways. So this is
Yeah.
just shooting yourself in the foot. He should be thanking Christians for coming up with techniques and principles and studies on oral traditions to help with this kind of stuff. So if we're going to like Simon Gathercole's work, The Alleged Anonymity of the Canonical Gospels, we have an early fragment, I believe, of Matthew and forget what it was. One is of John and one is of Matthew. So we have those early. I can pull up the chart here in a second here. So yeah, it's P66. It's late second or early third, and it attributes it to John. We have P4. We have a flyleaf attributing that gospel to Matthew. Again, late second or early third. I believe Mark and Luke we don't have till later. But again, every manuscript we have of them attributes it to Mark and Luke. They might bring up P1, which is a fragment of the Gospel of Matthew, and it's the first page, and they'll go, well, this doesn't have a title, but Wesley Huff is actually working on this in his dissertation, and he says no, there's plenty of room in that fragment for a title which could have had the Gospel of Matthew at the top, which we've now lost, or it could have had a flyleaf on top, like what we see with P4, for example. So that is just a fragmented copy. It's not an actual anonymous gospel. We don't know what the title on that one was, but given the circumstantial evidence, it was probably Matthew, given that every other manuscript we have says Matthew.
Awesome. Would you say there's anything internally, not direct, but internally within the Gospels to suggest authorship?
Internally, yeah. So let's go to the Gospel of John, for example. John says the writer. Let's just be fair here. Let's be skeptical. The writer says that he was the author. It says it in John 19. It says, he who witnessed this, is writing this. John 21 as well talks about the beloved disciple as the author of this gospel. Now, what Craig Blomberg did in his book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel, just went through all the facts that he gets right after right after right after right, and just lists over and over again. Like, gets, like meteorological facts right, geographical features right, correct names of towns and customs, and just says a bunch of stuff that had been odd for him to make up. Has a lot of presents a lot, like, for example, Jesus's prayer in John 17 with a lot of Aramaisms, for example. Also, what we see is really interesting is we see something odd when it comes to John and Luke's gospel. We see a lot of similarity, and this has been noted by like F.L. Cribbs, for example, Luke Vandewey recently in his book Living Footnotes in the Gospel of Luke. There's a lot of similarity between John and Luke in weird and odd ways, and what they basically argue is that Luke did not use the Gospel of John as a source. We know that he used Mark as a source, and we know what that looks like. He didn't use the Gospel of John as a source, but he used a lot of Yohanan stories, sayings. So it seems as though he is using John, the beloved disciple, as a source for his own gospel. Well, that would be an actual interesting tell that John actually was an eyewitness, because who does Luke say he talked to? Eyewitnesses. One of the eyewitnesses he seems to have spoken to is the guy who would later write the Gospel of John. So there's an interesting feature right there, and then what Luke Vandewey notes in his books. Here's what he says. He says in his book on pages 129 and 130, if we examine the 19 occasions in which Luke deliberately moves away from the Matthew and Mark accounts, whenever a Yohanan counterpart is present, 16 of the 19 occur in places that the beloved disciple is implied to be present in the Gospel of John. This correspondence becomes more significant as we consider that the beloved disciple is only implied to be present in approximately 32 of the 879 verses in the fourth gospel. In other words, Luke seems to be dependent on some eyewitness that would later write the Gospel of John. Luke is actually independently attesting that the Gospel of John was written by someone who was an eyewitness. So Luke Vandewey was able to note this as a very interesting feature.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What would you say here's the question. So Mark being the earliest source, if you go with majority of scholars saying that Mark is written first, and that was used as a source by Matthew and Luke, why would they use Mark as a source when, say, for example, Matthew was a disciple, an eyewitness to the things that Mark himself reports?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Papias tells us that Matthew wrote the Logia in a Hebrew dialect. Now, that seems to be a list of sayings. I suspect if Q existed, that's probably what Q was. So a list of sayings. We have to remember what Mark is writing is the preaching of Peter, who is in Jesus's inner circle. James, John, Peter, Jesus's inner circle. They were at the transfiguration. Matthew wasn't. They were closer to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew wasn't. So why would Matthew not want to use such an important document that came from the preaching of Peter, who was even closer to Jesus than he was? It just seems to logically follow. It's like if I wanted to write a biography of my father and I found out that my mother dictated one on her deathbed, I would look at that for sure because she's closer to my father. That makes total sense. What I think happened is Matthew wrote a list of sayings. Then all of a sudden, this Gospel of Mark starts circulating, and he goes, wow, this was a great idea. This is a really good idea. Mark did a great job, and he went right to Peter. This is wonderful. I'm going to take what he wrote, and since we are preaching primarily to Jews, I'm going to add in some of my own eyewitness stories. I'm going to add some of my own stuff here and make a gospel that aims to witness to the Jews. And this is what scholars like Dale Allison will note, is that Matthew seems at times to actually be correcting or like doing stuff to Mark that makes Mark more reliable or accurate. So it's really interesting what we see when we're going through that gospel. He seems to, so he says, for example, in the preface for the historical Jesus in the Temple, which he wrote for Michael Patrick Barber's book, Dale Allison says, I've occasionally concluded that in this or that respect, the first gospel represents the past better than the second gospel. So what we tend to see with the Gospel of Matthew is that he takes the Gospel of Mark and he just enhances it with his own eyewitnesses' accounts. And this is what we would expect an eyewitness to do. And this seems to be what the data indicates.
Great. And I want to throw out another objection to you from Rabbi Skobac. So we'll play another clip.
We know that the followers of Jesus were simple Jews from the Galilee who spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in a very academic Greek. So it's hard to assume that the associates of Jesus all of a sudden are able to write in Greek.
What do you make of that?
They're not sophisticated biographies. They're not as sophisticated as Plutarch, Suetonius, Tacitus. They're like basically like biographies that are like kind of rough. Like Mark's Greek is really rough. It's not the best. Matthew and Luke actually have to correct his grammar at times. So this idea that it was very sophisticated is absurd. It's not what scholars say. The Gospels are more like popular level biographies, if anything. They're not sophisticated Greco-Roman biographies. They're popular level biographies written for, uneducated people, lay people, to teach them about Jesus. It's not like, it's a difference between like, when a scholar, I know, for example, Chip Bennett, he's a scholar who became a pastor for a big church in Florida. The way he writes his sermons is not the way he wrote his academic papers. The Gospels seem to be more akin to like the sermon than like Suetonius or like Polybius, would be more akin to like the academic paper. Okay. They both can give you really good, accurate information, but one is written for more of a popular audience. One is written for more of a scholarly audience. So the Gospels are popular level biographies. This idea they couldn't speak Greek is rejected by scholars. It seems as though that it was pretty common in that day and age for Jews to speak and converse in Greek. I mean, Hellenism basically spread around the world. They were conquered by the Roman Empire. It was basically the language of people today, like kind of like how English is today. I was just in London for a conference and we had French there. We had Germans there. They spoke English because they told me that's the language of business. You want to do business, you got to learn English in Europe. Everyone can just speak English. When I went to China a couple of years ago, a lot of people spoke English. People that were factory workers, not people that were like, scholarly. These were just regular Joes in a factory, and they're conversing in English with me. I was shocked. So I mean, like, it's similar with Greek. People around the world today have to learn English in school. China, Europe, because that's the language of business. Likewise, in the ancient world, people had to learn Greek because that was the language of business. So it's probably likely that Jesus spoke a lot of Greek, and so did many of his disciples. Peter J. Williams makes a case that when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, that may have been given in Greek because it mentions people coming from Gentile regions to hear Jesus speak just before he gives it. And it probably would have made sense for him to give it in a language that they would have more readily understood and more people would have understood. So it seems as though a lot of evidence that presented by Stanley Porter, Peter J. Williams, that they did speak Greek. So the Gospels probably do contain some of the original words that Jesus spoke in Greek.
Yeah, I think this assumption, whether Rabbi Skobac has this assumption or not, for a lot of Jewish people, Greek is associated with being non-Jewish, right? So like Hebrew, Aramaic, that's Jewish, but in the ancient world, you say Greek is something we stay away from. That's from the pagans. But I think about that and I think, well, what about Josephus? What about Philo? What about the letter of Aristeas? What about the Septuagint? And these are just sources that are written in Greek, but are Jewish. And so I don't know if that's where Rabbi Skobac's coming from, but I do see that problem when today when many Jewish people are not keeping in mind the Second Temple period Judaism.
Yeah, the prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, there wasn't this rejection of Greek. There was actually a lot more Greek Jews interested in Hellenism, like Philo is a very obvious example, that did speak Greek. After the destruction of the temple, there was definitely a shift of the Jews to move more away from that and to be more distinct as a people. But prior to that, they were very much Hellenized, very much interested in Greek works, Greek culture. It was spreading throughout Judea. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, close to the city of Sepphoris, for example. Tiberias as well. These were Greek-speaking cities right in the Galilee. So plenty of evidence Jesus spoke Greek.
Yeah, absolutely. And our history of like the context of the story of Hanukkah is all Greek literature from the Maccabean literature. So it's important to keep in mind. I want to play another clip.
But more problematic is that the dating of these documents, according to virtually all Christian scholars, is that they're written approximately between the years 70 and 100, meaning that these Gospels are written between 40 and 70 years after Jesus is crucified. Now, if Jesus' followers, let's say his followers were 25 years old. I don't know how old they were. I'm suspecting they weren't 14. And they probably weren't 50 years old. So I'm guessing, if we want to be generous, that his followers were 25 years old. That would mean that they wrote these documents between the ages of 65 and 95 years of age. Now, did they know they were going to live that long? I mean, 95 was not typical for 2,000 years ago. And even if they suspected they might live into old age, why would they have waited so long to write these stories?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems here. So let's just take the dating that he has right there.
Sure.
Yeah, typically a rabbi would have disciples younger than him. So we know Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry. That's what Luke says. And so the disciples would have been younger. Probably, I think 25 would probably be the age of some of the disciples. I think some were probably younger. Amram Troper notes that, the average age Jewish men would marry is around 30, for example. Michael Satlow notes the same. And they spent a lot of time prior to that, if they were a student of the rabbi, learning under the rabbi. So some of the disciples may have been like 18, 19. I think John was probably very young, for example. But I mean, that's a side issue. So, I mean, like, this idea, first of all, talk about life expectancy. If you live past the age of 25, you are very likely to make it to your 60s. It was very common for that to be the case. The reason why the life expectancy was so low in the ancient world is because it's balanced by high infant and child death. But if you live past the age of 25, you were likely to live into your old age unless you died of war, for example. So not an issue. I believe, I forget the psalm, but isn't there a psalm that says, like, people are living in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, even, for example? Psalm 90:10. The years of our lives are 70. And even by reason a strength of 80, yet the span is but a toil and trouble. They are gone, they are soon gone, and we fly away. So here we have a psalm talking about it's pretty normal for people to live to their 70s, and even 80s. So, I mean, like John, for example, let's say he was 20 in 33 AD when Jesus died. I mean, just do the math. He would not have been 100 when he was writing in the 90s. And he seems to have been an exception. The church tradition is that he lived exceptionally long compared to the other disciples. So, yeah, not an issue, for example, the early church. Now, why did they wait so long? Probably because they were preaching and then they started to get to the end of their lives and they realized, well, I guess we should write this stuff down now that we're not going to be here anymore. And that's just a logical conclusion to make. When you're getting old, you spent your life preaching it, you're going to start writing down your life's work. A lot of people do that. They write down I know people that, we know people who've written biographies about themselves, autobiographies towards the end of their life, like people in World War II, for example. You start getting to the end of your life, you want to start leaving behind a legacy and memories. That's when you do that kind of stuff. So not an issue there. But let's talk about the dating of the Gospels. That's still within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, so this is hardly an issue. But there's arguments that have been presented that Mark, Matthew, and Luke are actually pre-70 AD. And one of the interesting arguments doesn't come from them, but comes from the book of Acts. This comes from a scholar named Adolf von Harnack. A.T. Robinson also supported it. Recently, Jonathan Bernier wrote a book, and he, again, reiterated some of these arguments. So if you look at Acts, for example, it has this climactic buildup to Paul going to Rome to speak before Caesar. And then he gets to Rome, and then it just says he lived there for 2 years and at his own expense, and that's the end. It's incredibly odd. You have these foreshadowing that he's going to go to Rome, and then an angel shows up on the ship and says, you will stand before Caesar. Okay, Adolf von Harnack noted if Luke was writing like 20, 30 years after the fact, he would never have ended with that enigmatic ending. He would have ended with his trial before Caesar. Okay, so you have this big buildup that you never lay off. And so Adolf von Harnack noted that, well, it seems as though that Luke, the only reason Luke would have ended Acts at that point is because that's where it ended in terms of the timeline, meaning that it ended while Paul was still under house arrest in Rome. Okay, he was written before his trial before Caesar, before his death, before the great persecution of Christians, the death of James, all of which is missing in Acts.
Yeah.
So if Acts was written around 62, 63, 64 AD at the latest, Luke had to be written first. And if Luke used Mark as a source, Mark had to be written before then. So now you have 3 works all before the destruction of the temple. Then you have Charles Quarles noting that Matthew talks really nice about Romans, which is unlikely before the Roman persecution. He talks about customs, about sacrificing before the altar or offering gifts to the altar, assuming the temple is still there. So Matthew also seems to be writing pre-destruction of the temple because he's telling the Jews of the time, customs and that Jesus taught on how to give proper gifts at the altar at the temple. That would not have been included if that had not existed at the time when Matthew was writing.
Yeah, this seems very strong to say that it was written before 70, especially. It's before the martyrdom of James or Jacob and Paul. So my question now is, why is the dating of the Gospels the way it is in modern scholarship? Like, why haven't the Robinson and Von Harnack been able to convince the majority of scholars on this?
Yeah. The reason why scholars tend to date them is because of a long felt bias in scholarship that is now being rejected, but the dating still remains, which is that Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. He obviously couldn't have predicted it. So therefore, we have to date Mark 270 AD because that's when the destruction of the temple happened. Now, it's kind of interesting that they'll put Mark as early as possible. They seem to be recognizing it's an early document, but they can't go past that date. So they'll go as close as they can to it. But I mean, again, Book of Daniel predicts the destruction of the temple. Do we have to date Daniel as 70 AD? No, that's absurd. So why couldn't Jesus have predicted the destruction of the temple as well? Josephus mentions another Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple before it happened. So, why couldn't this seems to be a common theme, predicting the temple to be destroyed because of the sin of the priests and the Sanhedrin, for example. Jesus probably predicted it as well. Seemed like a logical conclusion for them. So scholarship kind of has set that, but I mean, now a lot of scholars are recognizing. Michael Patrick Barber talks about this in his book. the historical Jesus in the temple, that seems as though a lot of those arguments are being rejected by scholars now, yet they're still sticking with the 70 AD date because it's so traditional. But scholars like, for example, James Crossley and Maurice Casey date Mark even earlier than I do, and they're atheists. They date Mark to the 40s, for example. Thinks it fits better with that time and custom. So yeah, I don't get a lot of those reason. There's no good reason to date Mark to 70, other than it just is a long-standing tradition in scholarship today at this point. I have yet to see a good reason to date Mark to 70 AD. The only reason we're getting is, well, the destruction of the temple setting, but scholars seem to be rejecting that now.
Yeah. Especially also considering how Jewish the Gospels are themselves, being Shabbat, from purity laws, all those kinds of things. The temple, it makes sense within a first century Jewish context.
Yeah, that's one of the arguments that Maurice Casey uses about specifically picking grain on the Sabbath. That
Right.
story. He's like, no Gentiles after 70 AD would have cared about this. This story would have been forgotten. But Jews before 70 AD would have greatly cared about this issue. This seems to fit more with that culture when Mark. So that's why it would have been written down in Mark early on.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the way the gospel writers present Jesus as fulfilling prophecies of the Messiah from the Tanakh? Like, I know John Dominic Crossan, for example, will say that they took the text, what they saw as messianic prophecies in the Tanakh itself, and then shaped the narrative from those prophecies. Mark Goodacre has a paper he interacted with John Dominic Crossan's this argument. But I'm curious what you think when it comes to this, when it comes to the way the gospel narratives tell the story of Jesus while also appealing to the Israel scriptures.
Yeah, this was a common custom of the time. What you would generally do is you would write in a typological fashion, that the Hebrew scriptures were, more relevant to their culture. They were not just these dead documents; they were living documents, and they could be applied to the Jews of the time. So a lot of the passages in the Old Testament could have been understood typological. God is fulfilling something through this in our time. So this was common. We see this, for example, in some of the Targums. It was very common to take passages from the Old Testament and typologically apply them in their culture of the time. They're not saying that Isaiah was specifically saying this thing. They're reworking the passage to apply to the culture of the time. And a lot of scholars have noted this, from Craig Blomberg, John Wenham, Paul Copan, for example. This is very common to do. So yes, they do take a lot of Old Testament passages, which are not prophecies about the Messiah, but they're taking them in a typological fashion, not a literal fashion.
Right. And I think it's interesting too that when it comes to counter missionaries like Michael Skobac or Tovia Singer or others, they really think that the gospel writers are taking these passages from the Tanakh out of context, and saying like those aren't messianic prophecies. Those are talking about Israel or other figures. But it's interesting that the gospel writers use these scriptures while they're telling the story of Yeshua's life. It seems to me that they're trying to be as faithful as possible to telling what would actually happen, and then using Israel scriptures as a way to express that story, which makes sense because they're Jews.
Yeah, they're trying to say, look at how Jesus has fulfilled all the scriptures. He has lived out Israel's existence in a more perfect way. So obviously they think all the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible are going to apply it to him in some way.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The last clip I want to show.
There is no corroboration outside of the Christian Bible. There are no contemporary historical sources outside the Christian Bible to corroborate not just the resurrection, by the way, any of the Christian story.
Well, that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that and I was like, is he that clear about? Yeah, he's saying there's no corroboration.
We have Josephus, we have Tacitus, we have Suetonius. There's a lot of secular sources or non-Christian sources that mention Jesus in some things. So the testimonium, is a very interesting one. Thomas Schmidt just published a book on it.
Yeah.
Arguing that the whole thing, or a lot of more than what we thought, the book is Josephus and Jewish New Evidence for the One Called Christ. He's just published a book that maybe a lot of the testimonium might actually be reliable. Here's the testimonium from Josephus. In this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of miraculous deeds, a teacher of men who received truth with pleasure. And he led many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who at first loved him did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them alive again on the third day, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of Christians, whose name for him has not disappeared. Now, Thomas Schmidt is actually arguing that a lot of what's in there may be more reliable than what we thought. And so if you want to check out his book, I've not had time to read it yet. So here's one of the ways he has put it in his book. And in this time there was a certain Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, a teacher of men who received truisms with pleasure. And he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was thought to be the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who at first were devoted to him did not cease to be so. For on the third day, it seemed to them that he was alive again, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of Christians who were named for him has not disappeared. So that's one of the ways he seems to be translating it in the way that what he thought Josephus meant to say when he was putting it down. So again, confirming a lot of what we see in the Gospels, a lot of the same information. We have, of course, Tacitus also confirming the death and crucifixion of Jesus. We have, for example, Celsus confirming a lot of aspects about Jesus as well, writing later. We have the letter of Mara ben Serapium, for example, as well, confirming aspects about Jesus. Lucian confirms some aspects about Jesus. You have Phlagian and I believe Thales confirming the darkness during the time of Jesus, which are their writings have been preserved by other church fathers as well. So we have all these other aspects confirming stories about Jesus. But even if that's the case, that wouldn't mean the Gospels are unreliable. That wouldn't mean we can't trust anything in the Gospels. If you go through my series on the reliability of the Gospels, we have plenty of reasons to trust the reliability of the Gospels. Some of the reasons I've listed here. Just because we don't have other works confirming everything in the Gospel, that doesn't mean they're unreliable. That wouldn't follow at all.
Yeah. And I also, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of potentially, a double standard of the resurrection event of the Tanakh is really, I see it as God giving Israel the Torah at Mount Sinai. And what external corroboration is there for that event? I can't think of
a lot
any.
of stuff in the Hebrew, but I think about stuff about Elijah, for example. All of his arguments, he has not thought these through, because if he were to take them and apply them to the Hebrew Bible, he'd have to throw out the Hebrew Bible. It's far less as reliable. I think it is reliable, but it's not nearly as reliable as the Gospels in the New Testament are. So he is shooting himself in the foot in ways he does not realize.
Should we expect there to be more external corroboration than we do see, or do we have more than one would expect for corroboration for an ancient document like the four Gospels?
I think we have more than we would expect. I mean, most of the documents from the ancient world have been lost, so we have to go on what we actually have. And even what we do have, they're focusing on. They're not caring about some backwater preacher in Judea. They're focusing on like the Roman wars and what the emperors are doing and more prominent figures of the time. Why would, for example, Tacitus care to mention more about Jesus? Josephus is focusing on the Jewish wars, the antiquity of the Jews. He mentions Jesus and moves on because he wants to talk more about his people. He's not writing a biography about Jesus, so that we wouldn't expect him to mention more.
Well, Skobac would press and say a resurrection event, that seems like something that more people would be talking about. And he says, Skobac also says that Jesus only appears to people who already believed him to be the Messiah. So what do you say when it comes to that, at least specifically the resurrection, when it comes to that? Should we expect more corroboration?
Well, it's just false. He appeared to James, his brother, who was not a believer during Jesus' lifetime. He appeared to Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians. So this is false. But again, you could apply the same thing to the Exodus. Where are the Egyptians mentioning the plagues? Where are the Egyptians mentioning them taking over Canaan. Like these are the arguments atheists use against like the Hebrew Bible that I have spent, a large section of my ministry defending, doing rabbis like this guy a favor. Again, he's using the arguments atheists would have a field day with when it comes to the Hebrew Bible. He shouldn't be doing this. And he would not use it. I doubt he'd use the same reasoning. We don't just dismiss the Exodus account because the Egyptians didn't mention it. We have plenty of good evidence for the Exodus that I talk about on my channel.
Yeah, definitely recommend that for people to watch.
Yeah. So like, it's a really weird double standard coming from this guy. You'd be very careful. Like when I'm evaluating Islam, because I'm doing a lot right now, I'm trying to think, okay, let me try not to be super biased because I'm against Islam. Is this an argument that could be used against Christianity or Judaism or some other religion? I don't want to just use it because it will help me attack Islam. I want to use it because it's a good argument and it's true. This rabbi just seems to be throwing anything he can against Christianity, not realizing he'd be destroying the Hebrew Bible with his own works.
Yeah, I think that's key. Reflecting on these objections raised by Skobac that we just went over, what do you think is the biggest misconception people have, or misconceptions that people have about the Gospels and how they were written?
Yeah, I think people sort of think that these were late legends written later, not by people who cared about historical facts. They're just telling stories. Very, very unlikely. These were people very much interested in trying to convince people Jesus was the Messiah, so they wanted to get their facts right. People bring up the biases of the gospel writers if that's a problem. But I mean, again, if they were so interested in convincing people that Jesus really is who he says he was and is the Messiah, maybe they were so obsessed with getting their facts right in order to convince enough people. Like maybe they really did want to convince a lot of people. And they knew they needed to use facts to do so because they could have critics like later Celsus, for example, who could use whatever they could to attack the Gospels. And they didn't want to prevent that. So they wanted to get as many facts as right as possible so they could prevent critics from coming after them and debunking them and pulling people away from Christianity. It's the same reasoning that you could say apologists have today. We want to get our facts right so we don't have 1,000 atheist videos showing how stupid we are. So, I mean, like the same kind of thing there, you could say applies to ancient writers, same kind of principles. So I think people need to get that, to look at it from that perspective and not just think because they were biased, we can't trust them.
Yeah. And what do you think would be, I know you devoted so much time to unpacking the genre of the Gospels and why they should be treated as historical sources, but how would you succinctly answer why the Gospels should be treated as historical memory rather than like theological fiction?
Well, I would say start to evaluate some of the evidence. This is what Luke Vandeweghe talks about in his book. He wrote a book called The Historical Tell, focusing on Luke. And he's basically saying, like, there are tells in the Gospels that make us go, well, these were written to preserve facts, and they're getting a lot of things right. So looking like the naming patterns in the recent study that he published with Jason Wilson, they basically came to the conclusion that the pattern of names in the Gospels could not have just come about from fiction writers. It had to be people on the ground getting eyewitness accounts about real people who interacted with Jesus. So things like that, the Aramaisms, for example, as well. The fact that Luke uses John as a source, yet he's not using the Gospel of John as a source. There's all these little historical tells throughout the Gospels that we can use. And I talk about them in my 15-part series on the reliability of the Gospels. A lot of strong evidence. Like what I talked about earlier with Jesus speaking in a rhythmic nature, a parallelus mus membarum. Okay, that's something that you wouldn't make up if you were writing fiction. You just make Jesus say whatever you want. Why do you have to make Jesus talk in a rhythmic fashion? Well, if you're trying to preserve his actual words, that's what we would expect. So I tell people to study the historical tells, the little details. The details start to add up, and you get a pretty strong cumulative case for gospel reliability.
So what books would you recommend people who are interested in getting more into this to start reading?
Yeah, check out Luke Vandeweghe's books, Living Footnotes in the Gospel of Luke, The Historical Tell, Craig Blomberg's book, The Reliability of John's Gospel, Peter J. Williams, Can We Trust, I believe it's Can We Trust the Gospels is his book. That's a good one to go to. Pretty good places to start, I would say. That's going to give you a good cover of a lot of the Gospels there. If you just go through my series, The Reliability of the Gospels, you'll get plenty of sources I use. You can always read, like Jonathan Bernier's book, Redating the Gospels, for example.
Awesome. Awesome. And I do want to ask you personally, what role has this historical investigation or historical apologetics in particular when it comes to the Gospels? How has that affected your own faith?
Yeah, it's sort of just helps strengthen it. The more I study it, the more I study the Gospels, the more I realize how little excuses I have to keep making for them. Like, like sometimes you get Christians, they become Christians and they get objections and they come up with on the spot explanations or excuses. Like, well, maybe this is what John was doing. Maybe this is what Mark was doing. The more I study the reliability of the Gospels, the more I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of evidence we have for them. And the evidence that is coming out within recent years as well is just phenomenal. So it's just remarkable. All this evidence we have that's building up, strengthening the reliability. It's incredible.
Absolutely. I can definitely resonate with that. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time to share about the reliability of the Gospels. If you're interested in digging deeper into this topic of area of apologetics, I highly recommend subscribing to Michael's channel, Inspiring Philosophy. I'll link his playlist to the reliability of the Gospels in the description below. So thank you again, Michael, for sharing with us today. And I appreciate all the great work you're doing on Inspiring Philosophy. And thank you all for taking the time to watch or listen. We appreciate you, and I'll see you next time on Two Messianic Jews.